Chapter 64. Bhumika. Even with the use of a palanquin, she was exhausted by the time they reached the Bower of Bones. Labor had left her body changed and depleted, and the baby barely slept. Thank the spirits that she had Sima to give her advice on keeping the poor child alive. "This is no place for you," she thought, holding Padma close to her chest. They had made it to the Bower of Bones. There were fine, delicate profusions of bones upon the ground, clinking like the leaves above them. No place for any of us. As Khalida kept watch, she rested her back against a tree and fed Padma. She was so tired that she could have wept. "Not long now," she whispered to Padma, who was now only quietly fretful. "Soon we will be home." "The city isn't safe," Khalida reported later. She and Jivan had entered Hiranaprastha, returning to the edge of the forest where the others waited with what news they were able to gather. People are protecting their own homes as best as they can, but guards and soldiers without masters are causing plenty of havoc. We could be in trouble if we enter the city as we are. Bhumika nodded in acknowledgement, unsurprised. Her mind was overfull with possibilities and concerns, the likely distance of imperial forces sent to quell unrest or provide the region aid, the quantity and strength of the soldiers she and the others would have to face, whether they would end up caught between multiple forces in the melee of blood. "We don't have to fight," Priya said suddenly. "There is a way to move through the city without upsetting anyone until we're ready and able to deal with them." Priya's plan was neat and simple, and Bhumika couldn't keep an approving look from crossing her face. "See?" Priya said with a smile. "I am clever. Shows you." "I've never said that you are not clever. You call me a fool all the time." Bhumika wrinkled her nose and looked away. "Sisters." "We're prepared," one rebel said soon after. The vile cursed stood in a circle around them. Ashok was lying near them, wrapped in a shawl, Padma fussing in her blanket next to him. Priya met Bhumika's eyes. Bhumika nodded. A slow, shared exhale of breath, and the ground around them bloomed with sharp flowers, stormy purples and bitter yellows. The rebels breathed with them, sharing strength. The flowers began to rise up the rebels' feet. Bhumika looked down and watched them curl around her own ankles, moving across her like new flesh. The city was broken, buildings burnt and smoldering. The few that stood shuddered and boarded. There were figures moving in the distance, groups of men with axes or maces, faces swathed in cloth. But they didn't approach the rebels or the people of the Mahal. Even from a distance, the leaves and flowers rising from their skin were visible. They looked like a huddle of rot sufferers, stumbling wide-eyed through the city that had no place for them. They were given a wide breath. Bhumika held Padma, who was blessedly sleeping, against herself as they crossed Hiranaprastha and gazed at the Mahal. Its outer walls were shattered, where the rebels had broken the stone with vine and shifted the foundations by moving soil and root with their vile cursed strength. But as Bhumika looked, she saw a light flickering from deep within the Mahal. A woman on the walls, an arrow nocked upon her bow. Bhumika shouldered to the front, head held high. When the woman on the wall saw her, she lowered her bow, gave a shout, and with relief, Bhumika realized her people had held the Rose Palace after all. "The thorns kept the worst out," the maid servant Gauri said gruffly. She walked with obvious pain, but there was a steel to her that told Bhumika she held her own well since Bhumika's departure. "Those are vicious, my lady. We were glad of them." A handful of exhausted Parijati and Adhiyani soldiers, the armed maids, the orphans. These were the people who had held the Mahal since Bhumika's departure. The servants looked uneasily at the rebels but said nothing. It was a relief at least that the rebels possessed a good sense not to wear their masks. But Bhumika had no desire to test her servants turned soldiers, or the fragile, uneasy truce that had grown between their retinue and Ashok's. It would not take much, she knew, to destroy it. "Take her," she said, turning to Jivan and handing him her sleeping daughter. "If I don't return, she'll need a wet nurse. Speak to the maids, they'll arrange it." He stared at her stricken. "I must go to the Hirana," she said. "I must gain the strength we need to keep this country safe." He looked as if he were struggling for words. "Speak up," she said to him. "She will have no one," he said finally. "My lady." "If I die, then she's no one's child," Bhumika said, "and that would be fitting, I suppose. It was my fate once, and I refused it. but she touched her own face to Padma's regardless, and breathed her in, and kissed her forehead before straightening up. Jivan bowed his head to her, said nothing more as she left, his hands gently clasped around the small bundle. Together they began the walk to the Hirana, the rebels, her siblings. Priya, expression determined, Ashok half-conscious, blood trickling from his nose. "Lean on me," said Priya. Ashok shook his head exhausted. "I can carry you," said Priya, taking his arm.